Michelle Martinko was born on October 6, 1961, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to Albert and Janet Martinko. As the younger of two daughters, Michelle grew up in a close-knit family where she was known for her intelligence, charm, and dedication. She was a promising student at Kennedy High School, excelling in academics, and she quickly gained the admiration of her teachers and peers. Michelle was an active participant in extracurricular activities, demonstrating her versatility and talent. She was particularly involved in the school's concert choir, where her voice stood out, and she also participated in various theater productions, showcasing her passion for the arts. Despite her many talents, Michelle had a somewhat solitary nature. She struggled to form close friendships with other girls at school, a situation that some speculated was due to jealousy or rivalry. Michelle's beauty, along with her success in academics and extracurriculars, may have made her a target for envy. Another contributing factor to her social isolation was her past relationships, particularly with a boy she had dated, which may have stirred conflict among her peers. Nonetheless, Michelle remained focused on her studies and her future, which she envisioned would involve attending Iowa State University to study interior design. Her aspirations were not the only thing she had been looking forward to in the final months of 1979. Michelle had recently purchased a winter coat on layaway, planning to finalize the payment that evening. On December 19, 1979, Michelle attended a banquet at the Sheraton Inn in Cedar Rapids, where her high school's concert choir performed. She wore a black jersey dress with a matching scarf, black pantyhose, and heels, carrying a brown leather purse. After the banquet, Michelle intended to stop by Westdale Mall to pick up her coat. She had invited friends to join her, but each of them declined, leaving Michelle to go to the mall alone. At the mall, Michelle spent time visiting various stores, engaging with friends and acquaintances who worked there. She was last seen around 9 p.m. by a jewelry store, where she had likely been socializing with others. However, by the early morning hours of December 20th, Michelle had still not returned home. At 2 a.m., her father, Albert, became concerned and reported Michelle missing. He immediately set out to look for her, desperately calling friends and acquaintances, but to no avail. A few hours later, at 4 a.m., Michelle's tan and green 1972 Buick Electra was found in the parking lot of Westdale Mall, near a JCPenney store. The car's doors were locked, but inside, Michelle's lifeless body was discovered slumped over in the front passenger seat. She had been brutally stabbed 29 times, with wounds to her face, neck, and chest. The discovery of her body sent shockwaves through the community, sparking fear and grief among those who knew her. Michelle's tragic death was a senseless act of violence, one that would remain unsolved for nearly 4 decades. Michelle Martinko's brutal murder sent shockwaves through Cedar Rapids, leaving the community in fear and disbelief. The investigation, however, began with numerous challenges. The circumstances surrounding Michelle's death raised questions almost immediately. Upon discovering her body inside her car at Westdale Mall, investigators noted the viciousness of the crime. Michelle had been stabbed 29 times in the face, neck, and chest, indicating a personal and intense attack. Despite this, there was no evidence of robbery. Michelle's purse contained $180, and the other items inside the car had not been touched. This led police to believe that the motive behind the murder was not theft, but something far more personal. At first, there were no obvious leads. The police began questioning witnesses and those who might have seen something unusual that night. They spoke with friends and acquaintances of Michelle, but nothing substantial came to light. Initial theories emerged, and rumors began circulating within the community. One of the earliest suspects was a man with a history of violent crime. In the weeks following Michelle's murder, police considered him as a possible suspect. However, DNA evidence later excluded him, leading investigators to look elsewhere. Despite having few concrete leads, investigators quickly focused their attention on Michelle's ex-boyfriend, Andy Seidel. Andy had dated Michelle for 2 years, and although they had broken up shortly before her death, their relationship had left a mark on both of them. He was known to have been possessive, and after their breakup, he continued to show interest in Michelle's life. Michelle's friends and family recalled that he would ask intrusive questions about who she was dating and what she was doing. Some even speculated that his jealousy might have fueled violent thoughts toward her. In the days after Michelle's death, Andy was brought in for questioning. Despite his possessive behavior, Andy was able to provide an alibi, confirmed by his mother, who said he had been home shortly after the mall closed. His alibi held up under investigation, and he was eventually cleared of suspicion. However, his emotional response at Michelle's funeral raised eyebrows. He appeared devastated, expressing that he needed to know who Michelle loved when she died. The intensity of his grief, coupled with his prior behavior, made many believe he might have had a motive, but there was no hard evidence to support this theory. As time passed, the investigation began to stall. A woman came forward months later with a potentially valuable tip. She had driven past the mall parking lot on the night of Michelle's murder and claimed to have seen a man standing next to Michelle's car. However, this crucial information was not passed on to the investigators until much later, hindering the progress of the case. The lack of physical evidence, combined with the failure to act on the tip in time, left the police without any solid leads. Despite these early setbacks, the investigation continued. As the weeks turned into months, and then into years, the case gradually went cold. The murder of Michelle Martinko remained an open case, but there were no new leads, and the chances of finding the killer seemed increasingly slim. The Cedar Rapids community, still haunted by Michelle's senseless death, struggled to move on, while law enforcement officers continued to search for answers that would never come easy. The case of Michelle Martinko's murder remained unsolved for almost 3 decades, but new forensic advancements would soon breathe life into the investigation. In 2006, a breakthrough occurred when a cold case investigator, reviewing old case files, discovered blood at the crime scene that had been left behind by the killer. This blood, found at the scene of the crime, was assumed to belong to the murderer. The investigators sent the sample to a lab for DNA profiling, which resulted in the creation of a partial male DNA profile. At first, investigators hoped that the DNA profile might match someone in the National Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. They ran the DNA through the system, but after testing, no matches were found. The lack of results was a frustrating blow. Despite this setback, the DNA evidence was crucial. The blood sample was the first solid evidence that could potentially lead them to the killer. Although there were no immediate suspects, the discovery of the male DNA profile provided a new direction for the investigation. In 2017, the case took another significant turn when DNA phenotyping was applied to the existing evidence. DNA phenotyping is a relatively new technology that can predict physical characteristics, such as hair color, eye color, and ancestry, based solely on DNA samples. This innovative technique was used to create a profile of what the killer might look like. The new analysis of the DNA provided a strikingly different image than the composite sketch created shortly after Michelle's murder. Whereas the original sketch had depicted a man with dark hair, the new phenotyping data suggested that the killer was likely a white male with blonde hair and blue eyes. The new developments in the case led investigators to believe they were finally closing in on the suspect, but they still needed to confirm these findings with further investigative work. In 2018, the breakthrough that many had been hoping for occurred. The DNA data from the case was uploaded to GeneMatch, a public genealogy website that had already been instrumental in solving other cold cases, including the Golden State Killer. GeneMatch works by comparing DNA from crime scenes to DNA samples uploaded by individuals researching their family trees. It was through this platform that investigators found a familial DNA match. The match linked the DNA from the crime scene to a man named Jerry Lynn Burns, a resident of Manchester, Iowa. Burns, a 25-year-old man at the time of Michelle's murder, had no prior criminal history. He had lived a relatively quiet life, running a powder coating business in Manchester. However, his familial connection to the DNA found at the crime scene made him the prime suspect. This familial DNA match provided the investigators with a name, but it would still take careful investigation and further DNA collection to definitively link Burns to the murder of Michelle Martinko. For over 30 years, the case had remained cold, with few leads and no clear direction. But the revival of the investigation, fueled by DNA technology, set the stage for a new chapter in the pursuit of justice for Michelle Martinko. Michelle's murder, however, they still needed to gather more evidence to confirm his involvement. The investigators covertly obtained a DNA sample from Burns, which would be critical to making the connection between him and the crime scene. In October 2018, investigators were able to collect a sample from Burns by using a rather discreet method. They observed him at a restaurant, and after he finished drinking from a soda, they retrieved the straw he had used. This straw, once tested, provided the final confirmation that Burns' DNA matched the blood found on Michelle Martinko's clothing. At the crime scene, the match was undeniable. Despite his denials and the lack of any direct acknowledgement of his involvement, Burns was now the central figure in the investigation. When questioned by investigators, Burns initially denied knowing Michelle Martinko or being at the Westdale Mall on the night she was murdered. His story was unconvincing, especially given the overwhelming DNA evidence linking him to the crime scene. Burns' inability to provide a plausible explanation for the presence of his DNA at the crime scene raised further suspicions. Throughout his interview, Burns showed little emotion, which only served to intensify the investigators' belief that they were dealing with a guilty individual. His nonchalant demeanor, coupled with his contradictory statements, gave investigators the impression that Burns was trying to distance himself from the crime. The investigation into Burns continued, with more evidence mounting against him. Despite his denials, Burns could not offer any logical explanation for why his DNA had been found on Michelle's clothing. At this point, the investigators were certain that they had found the person responsible for Michelle's murder. Jerry Lynn Burns, who had managed to evade justice for nearly 4 decades, was now the primary suspect. On December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years after Michelle's tragic death, Burns was arrested for her murder. His arrest was a pivotal moment in the case that had haunted Cedar Rapids for decades. For the Martinko family, the long search for answers had come to a head. While the arrest of Burns marked a significant step forward in the pursuit of justice, it also raised many questions. How had Burns, a man with no criminal history, committed such a heinous act? And why had he been able to live freely for nearly 40 years without facing any consequences for his actions? The arrest of Jerry Lynn Burns was not only a triumph for the investigation team, but also a somber reminder of how a brutal crime can linger in the collective memory of a community for decades. The relentless efforts of investigators, along with the innovative use of DNA technology, had brought the case back to life, and Burns was now facing the consequences of his actions. The trial of Jerry Lynn Burns for the murder of Michelle Martinko began in February 2020, more than 40 years after the tragic events that had shocked Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The long delay in justice was a result of decades of unanswered questions, but now, thanks to the advances in forensic science and the relentless work of investigators, the truth was finally coming to light. The case had become a symbol of both the persistence of law enforcement and the power of modern forensic technologies. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They argued that the DNA could have been transferred through secondary contact or mishandled during evidence collection. The defense even raised concerns about the possibility of contamination, suggesting that Burns' DNA may have been inadvertently introduced to the crime scene. To counter these claims, the prosecution called on experts who testified to the accuracy and reliability of the DNA evidence, explaining that the probability of someone else's DNA matching Burns at the crime scene was astronomically low. In addition to the DNA evidence, the prosecution also presented testimony about Burns' behavior during the investigation. A key moment in the case came when a former cellmate of Burns, Michael Allison, testified that Burns had made incriminating statements while in jail. According to Allison, Burns had expressed guilt and remorse, admitting to the crime in subtle ways. This testimony added weight to the prosecution's case, as it suggested that Burns' actions and statements pointed to his involvement in the murder. The defense attempted to discredit Allison's testimony, suggesting that he may have been seeking a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. However, the jury found the combination of DNA evidence and Burns' own behavior during the investigation to be compelling. Burns had repeatedly denied any involvement in the murder, but his inability to provide a credible explanation for the DNA found at the crime scene undermined his defense. The defense also argued that Burns' lack of emotion during his police interview was not necessarily indicative of guilt. but the prosecution contended that it was highly suspicious given the gravity of the crime. After 3 days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. On February 24, 2020, after only 3 hours of deliberation, Jerry Lynn Burns was found guilty of first-degree murder. The speed of the jury's decision was a testament to the strength of the evidence against him. Despite his claims of innocence, Burns was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction brought a sense of closure to the Martinko family, but it also underscored the emotional toll of a case that had remained open for so many years for Michelle's family, particularly her sister Janelle Stonebreaker. The verdict was bittersweet. While it brought justice for Michelle, it came too late for their parents, Albert and Janet Martinko, who had passed away years earlier without seeing the resolution of their daughter's case. The conviction of Jerry Lynn Burns, while an emotional victory, could not undo the years of pain and heartache that Michelle's family had endured. Yet, it provided a sense of justice that had long eluded them. As the trial came to a close, the case became a symbol of the impact of forensic science and the importance of perseverance in the pursuit of justice. The long wait for justice was finally over, and Jerry Lynn Burns was held accountable for the brutal murder of Michelle Martinko. The conviction of Jerry Lynn Burns for the murder of Michelle Martinko brought a long-awaited sense of closure to the case, but the emotional toll on Michelle's family and the Cedar Rapids community was undeniable. While the Martinko family could finally see justice served after decades of waiting, the pain of the unresolved tragedy was still deeply felt, especially by Michelle's sister, Janelle Stonebreaker. Both of Michelle's parents, Albert and Janet Martinko, had passed away years before the breakthrough in the case, leaving Janelle to bear the emotional weight of their shared grief. In the end, the legacy of Michelle Martinko is one of tenacity, justice, and remembrance. Her death and the years of investigation that followed may have brought pain, but they also brought about change. Her case has inspired countless others, showing that justice can be achieved even after decades of waiting, and reminding us all that every life, no matter how short, is worthy of justice. Michelle's memory will continue to live on, not just through the legal victory, but through the ongoing efforts to solve cold cases and bring closure to victims' families.